So I will tell you my problem, but before I do that, I want to give a little context because I'm guessing that HUD might be a little new to this group. So HUD gets about $40 to $50 billion every year. A good chunk of that goes toward the built environment. In addition to that, when a major disaster happens, Congress appropriates usually a large chunk of money to HUD outside of the annual budget. Right now we have a $45 billion with the B active grant portfolio in disasters. So we have another year of HUD that's managed by 15 people that are all term hires. And we don't have a lot of metrics, and we don't get very deeply involved in the actual expenditures at the project level, right? So my favorite metric, which is the most common in the CDBG program, is linear feet of public improvement. So it could be a sidewalk, it could be a wetland, whatever. Linear feet of public improvement. So to say that we have a challenge or a problem is probably an understatement. One of the things that we're working on right now is, we've had some good success being creative with some of the supplementals after Hurricane Sandy. We're working on some creative uses of CDBG DR, which is the Disaster Recovery Program, in Louisiana right now as well. But we need to look at our annual programs too. So that's $4 billion through the Community Development Block Grant that goes to 1,232 states and localities throughout the country. Half of it at the state level is spent on infrastructure, a third of it at the city level is spent on infrastructure. And there's a lot of flexibility for how communities use those funds. We have a rulemaking going through. This was my one objective for coming to this meeting, to tell you all this. We have a rulemaking going through right now which would amend the requirements that each of these jurisdictions have to fulfill in order to get the funding. So it's a block grant, right? So it's allocated by formula, but every 5 years they have to do a consolidated plan and say, here it's also targeted at low and moderate income people. I should have mentioned that. Here are the areas of need. Here's what we're going to focus on, and we're adding to that a specific identification of how climate change will impact low and moderate income populations. That was the language in the proposed rule. I will tell you that we're very likely to add language into the final rule within a week or two, which would also add consultation requirements to organizations like the RCSDs, the USDA climate hubs, land grant institutions that may receive money from NOAA, et cetera. So we're very much so trying to drive demand between that overcapacity urban planner that I referenced in my intro and all of you, with the exception of the other non-scientist urban planner types in the room, looking at you, Kristen, Jessica. And that is the key, right? So if we have this hook through the rulemaking and we have this extraordinary amount of funding that goes out and is spent in local communities, how do I, as the resilience policy team lead, how do I create the processes, the connections, the network, the tools, the resources, et cetera, to make it so that it's easy for not only the enterprising CDBG managers at the local level, but every CDBG manager at the local level to say, here is how climate change will impact the poor people in my community, and here are the things that I can do to address it. The other thing that I'll mention that we're working on too is $4 billion may sound like a lot of money. I think people were really happy with the $20 million that you budgeted, Dan. It's not a lot of money. We are not the biggest player in the world or in the US in infrastructure. The majority of the funding comes from the state and local level. I was really happy to hear Kristen say that she was messing around with her capital improvement plan. And that's something that we want to facilitate as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in the future through our disaster recovery programs you see some sort of resilience set aside where if you're willing to dust off your 20, 30-year-old projects that have been waiting in the capital improvement plan binder and say, how could we add a component to this that acknowledges the change that's happening in our communities and deals with that, then you might be able to access our funds to cover that differential. And we're also, within that bubble, we're also really interested in bringing more private finance into infrastructure in the United States. It's very common in other parts of the world. I think it's important to this context because one of the ways that is done is through novel procurement practices. So right now in the US, it's very common to do one RFP for the design of an infrastructure, one for the build, and then the public institution does all of the O&M. That totally ignores the infrastructure life cycle and doesn't align incentives that take into account global change and climate change. And so we're really trying to push design, build, operate, maintain contracts or outcome-based, performance-based contracting, where you're paying for an outcome and not a specific widget. And when you align those infrastructure life cycles, you're automatically baking in a consideration for change. So, well, I'll pass them on to somebody else.